I'm your host, Maya Plants. Today we interview Dr. Catherine van der Heyning. She is a professor of European Fundamental Rights Law at the University of Antwerp and a member of the Advisory Committee at the UN Human Rights Council. Her research focuses on the protection of procedural rights in the interaction between the domestic and the European courts. They presented 4 reports at the UN Human Rights Council, one addressing the impact of emerging technologies on the promotion and protection of human rights, another on gender inequalities, and a third on terrorism, and a 4th report on the pervasiveness of racism in our societies. Thank you for watching the UN Brief. Don't forget to subscribe.
So this report really focused on new and emerging technologies rather in the civil space. But it was one of the remarks of a member state, and it comes up in the report as well, that of course the challenges are not limited to the civic space, but in particular, and that's also, there's also a lot of new technology in the military domain, or maybe we can call it as well military new and emerging technologies, where we now really see that also being applied in warfare. And then we think in particular, of course, of those technologies where there's even no intervention anymore of a human person when an attack is being launched. And so that really also asks of us that we consider this, and that certain rules would be applied to that. The Geneva Conventions, of course, have been drawn up in an area where this was inconceivable, but it is very clear that we need an update of certain of those rules, and where we had some real recommendations and conclusions on the civic space. I think it's very important that the Human Rights Council also would take up those military technologies, or in particular the use of them in warfare, because that will have an impact on the treaties as they stand today.
So, what were some of the positive aspects of new technologies in promoting, protecting, preserving human rights frameworks? Because there are positive aspects, right? When you can record, for instance, instances of violence or police brutality, it has been important. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I think it's quite of our habit as human rights or international lawyers that we always focus on what is a threat or what is a challenge, and less as to what some challenges can really, I mean, the positive impact. And new technologies, and I think that's still the conclusion, has had such a tremendous positive impact, which we all felt during the COVID pandemic. It enabled us to continue to give education or receive education, communicate with each other, work, transfer money, etc. And I think that probably for me is still the core and the most important aspect, positive aspect of emerging technologies, is that it connects the world and it makes it possible to communicate. Someone in Japan can communicate with someone in Latin America and Europe at the same time. And you could hope that that would also result in more understanding and direct connection among humankind, which of course is a very beautiful outcome of this technology. And I think a clear example are the protests of youth around the world on climate change. And this is really also made possible because of this technology. A little girl that decides to not go to school and goes and sits down before the Swedish parliament, which results in a wave of protests of young people for climate change around the world. And this is really what is made possible by these technologies. And that's really, we've included that very explicitly in the report. And it is, before we talk about the threats, we talk about the positive impact that these technologies have, because it should not be forgotten when we discuss potential risks and threats and how to address them, that we do not forget what it brings to us as well.
Because one is focused on the horrors that happen through these platforms and how they should be regulated, and the platforms themselves are finally, the leadership are finally realizing that they have to come forward, they have to invest. They cannot have 6 people on the security team when they have 2 billion users on the platform, right?
Yeah.
So they're finally realizing this. So what you see is the role of the Human Rights Council in parsing through this vast field and looking at each technology and addressing its impact.
So you have seen, and I think that's really what Human Rights Council has focused as well on potential threats of digitalization and emerging technologies, but mostly, and that's because of the framework, of course, that United Nations put in place for human rights protection. You see it being looked at a specific rights angle. So you look at it from freedom of expression, or you take the perspective of privacy, or you take the perspective from security. And of course, these several inputs can clash if you really just focus on one right or on one topic. And so the report, on the one hand, of course, concludes that we need more research and some particular recommendations and focus. But on the other hand, I think that's one of the words that comes back mostly in this report is holistic, that you do need to also have that general look and look for the balances, because these new technologies can be a threat to freedom of expression, misinformation, silencing people, harassment on the one hand, and it can be to the benefit, the marketplace of ideas, how we can exchange information directly. We don't need newspapers to share information. We can avoid censorship. So that's the balance that really needs to be taken into account from this holistic approach. And also that these technologies also are interdependent. So you also see a lot of reports focusing on one technology, but maybe not taking into consideration that it is really the whole process and how these technologies are interconnected that might result in human rights violations or inequalities. We just talked about military technology. You have these automated weapons. And one of the questions might be, shouldn't we have always a human intervention? But on the other hand, you can look also at that part at the algorithms, and are algorithms fair and should they be transparent? So it's not just the outcome that you're studying, but also the very start, who do we include when we drop algorithms? How do we control them? Should they be transparent? So that is really that holistic approach, which of course the Human Rights Council should also be taken into account when looking at maybe a specific issue that is brought to the table, such as mass surveillance, or such as encryption, or inequality. They should also very much take into account that holistic approach when they decide on certain matters.
And they should maybe have independent committees looking at each technology separately in a way, too, because each technology has ramifications and implications, right? Mm-hmm. Like, for instance, health data, you could have just or do you have already that in place? How did the report came about? Like, how did you gather all this information? Because the report is very comprehensive.
Yes. The interest, I think that's also very much the merit, of course, of the advisory committee, is that it is composed of several experts in the field, but who have a very broad academic network, so that we can also draw from studies and research from other colleagues, and also have sometimes a very particular input. And that is, of course, what you also have at the level of the Human Rights Council, that you have this general approach, which can bridge sometimes when someone takes a very particular aspect or angle. And that is also how we drew up basically the report. It's an input of several of the members, who then add to the table their own experience and research, and where also further research was developed along the research. And then you have the input of NGOs, you have the inputs of member states, which of course triggers again to rethink certain of the concepts we put into the discussion. So it is really not the work of one person, but it's the work of several persons working on this report. And there you get, because it are the different angles, it's very holistic, not just as to what we recommend, but also as to our working process.
The big technology companies also participate, giving you input, or do you seek their input, or force? No, not necessarily for this particular report.
Well, it's the big tech companies and the industry has a vital role to play. And today they sometimes play a very positive role where they can stop certain abuses, and they do stop certain abuses, and they come with new technology. On the other hand, they also sometimes play a negative role in the sense that they do not act when they should act, and that their platforms sometimes are used for grave human rights violations. And so the industry has a very particular role actually in these new emerging technologies, where you cannot fight or tackle, you cannot tackle the challenges without them intervening, without them thinking out new technology, and they are a very important intermediary. So you should go and sit with them at the table when you discuss certain outcomes, certain technologies. And that is also one of the recommendations we make, to really include them as well into the discussions, but also really realizing what their role is, because they have these two angles to them, and in the end, profit is the major concern of these companies. So you also need to take some, you need to keep also some distance, but you do need them in that discussion. And so some input was also given to us to this report, but as we wanted really also to have a more general and a more global approach, we did not include them today or for this report into all the discussions, because we just wanted to avoid to go in too deep in those particular angles, and really to set out more the framework for the future. So how should we address these new technologies, call out some of the clear challenges, and also, and that's of course one of our findings, that you actually should go almost treaty by treaty to see whether it still functions in the digitalized times. We talked about Geneva Conventions, but of course there are other treaties as well, where you see that you really need to stretch those treaties today to apply them sometimes to new technologies. And that's an exercise that's being done in member states. That's an exercise that's being done at a supranational level. And so that's definitely also an exercise that needs to be done at the level of the United Nations.
And I think the UN Human Rights Council perhaps has a role as well in teaching, educating, these technology companies on the issues of human rights, because maybe they are not aware, because they have very small external affairs, public affairs teams, perhaps not commensurate with what is needed in order to really address the problem of the hate speech in the platforms, for instance. Yeah. So can we talk a little bit about the gender inequality report too? Are there new aspects that surfaced in the ways we can address gender inequality? Is the question of national, domestic law and international law clashing? And countries not respecting the treaties they are the signatories? So such as the Convention on Political and Civil Rights. So what did you see is the way forward?
It does start with some disappointments. If you look at the numbers that were included in the report, which was very enthusiastically welcomed actually during the session, and which is, outstanding work done by Professor Salmon, is that so little progress has been made during the last 20 years, and where there was a lot of positive energy, definitely some decades ago, you do see that it's stagnating at this moment. And where you see as well in the bodies that in some bodies there are a lot of women represented, but that often it's also very still gendered, in the sense that if you talk about children, well, in those committees, you will have more women But if you talk about some of the, are supposed to be the harder issues or the security issues, that you will see that less women are being representing the member states or representing the bodies and organizations. And so, of course, it starts with a lot of disappointment, and then to see how we move forward. And there are some very far-reaching conclusions, of course, that will stir a lot of debate, such as if there are two qualified candidates, that we should look at the underrepresented gender. And that is something I want to highlight. It's also talked about equality in gender. It's not talked about as women should always be selected, but it's important that we talk about the rights of children or of women, that men participate as well. But it also has other recommendations to enable real equality and participation. For example, it is very difficult, of course, if you're a single parent, to go to one of the sessions and really be included in those sessions and in those bodies, or to travel. And so that, of course, that is a more practical impact and a practical gendered element that should be taken in consideration as well, when we want to improve the representation of women in the several bodies.
Very much. Pleasure speaking with you, Professor Catherine van den Heyning.
Thank you.
Thank you.